States, nations, and nation states. Those are three terms which mean quite different things, but have a tendency to be confused, or people use them mistakenly. Being a political scientist, a teacher, I thought it might be a good idea to try to explain these different terms a little bit, and what's the meaning in them, what are the differences, etc. So we can start with a state. What is exactly a state? A lot of Americans might think that's the same thing as one of the different states within the country, which is in a certain sense true, but can be a bit confusing when we look at things more internationally. In its most basic definition, you could say a state that is a territory or region, an area controlled by a single government, and this government is sovereign. Sovereign meaning that there's is not dictated by another state. It is able to control its own affairs. It might have given away a certain amount of sovereignty and joining a form of confederation or a union, as we see in America. The different states have voluntarily entered into a union and formed the United States. Whilst in the rest of the world, a state that is simply a region or a territory controlled by a single government, elected or non-elected, dictatorship, democracy, king, whatever, as long as it is ruled by a single group and is, functions as one. That is a state. And again, an important part here being the sovereignty of the state, that it is able to control its own borders, enforce its own laws, and within this region, it is the power which dominates, makes the laws, controls everything. The next is the word nation. And this is definitely a word I can see often being confused by Americans, when they talk, people on the news saying, hello, nation, or this is to the nation, speech to the nation. Which I suppose makes sense to differentiate in the United States between the individual state and the collective United States. But the thing is, in the United States, at least, when they talk about the nation, they are kind of misusing the word, because a nation is something quite different than the united group of states, which is America. A nation, I prefer the Germanic or German word or Norwegian word, being Norwegian myself, which is folk. And the definition of a folk or a nation, that is a group of people, imagined or or real. A nation is the group which identifies itself as the nation, but they have a shared language, a shared history, and a shared view of belonging to the same group. And this is an interesting kind of idea. If you talk about a nationalist, what is a nationalist? Some people say it's someone who believes in the superiority of their group. When it really comes down to it, a nationalist is someone who believes that the world is composed of nations, and that these nations have a right to sovereignty and to collectively decide their own fate and their own path forward. So a nation is a collective group of people, a body politic, if you will, which consists or has a shared identity. And when we talk, what does a shared identity mean? Let's look at Norway, Norwegian people. If you are in the south of Norway or all the way in the north of Norway, there are certain regional differences, but you imagine yourself as belonging to the same larger group. The year 1945 or 1940, 9th of April 1940, when Norway was invaded by the Germans, that is an important year to both of these people on each side of the country. Or 1814, when Norway got its constitution and gained a certain amount of autonomy after being a slave or being a colony under the Danes for 400 years. That is an important year in the mind of the person in the south of Norway, in the west of Norway, east of Norway, north of Norway. And it is important to these people in a different way than, let's say, a Norwegian person living in Hedmark, which is in the east of Norway, and a Swedish person living across the border. They would not see these two dates as meaning something historically of significance. Furthermore, it's the language. The language helps build a view of a shared identity, being able to speak the same language. And this was a very important factor in the unification of the German Empire, because there were Germans literally all across Europe, spread across, and they had this idea that we belong together because we are the same nation, same people, same folk, because we speak the same language. Obviously, we have more in common. A German, a Prussian, and a Bavarian, despite having different religions, have more in common together than a Bavarian and a Frenchman, because the languages are different, their identity is different. So shared, culture. I see the culture of dress is the same or similar at least. We see this across Norway with the different bunad, traditional folk dresses. Look that up if you haven't seen them before. And also, shared cultural, cultural events, going to school together, going to or listening to certain types of music. Shared identity more or less. So that is what a nation is, or a folk is. And that would be a group of people, shared identity, shared culture, shared language, often shared religion as well, and also often shared, certain ethnic makeup. That defines what the folk is, or the people is, the nation is. And the next, next term which we could talk about is the nation state. And a nation state, that is literally when a state, as defined before, a territory controlled by a certain sovereign government, and the nation or folk coincide. That Norway is a very good example of this. The territory where Norwegians live is practically the same as the territory controlled by the Norwegian state, making Norway a nation state. Because the government or the state apparatus in Norway was formed to preserve and forward the interests of the Norwegian people, of the nation. Thereby, the state was created from the nation to promote the nation's interests, that making it quite very literally a nation state. And the reason, some could argue that the other Norway or other nation states aren't quite nation states because you have certain larger minorities within them. I could easily talk about that. That would be for Norway. In Norway's part, we have several called national minorities, minorities of a certain size, which have been in Norway for a long time. The most important of them being the Sami people in northern Norway. So someone might argue, well, Norway has a large population of Sami, therefore you cannot really say that Norway is a nation state. I would disagree on this because Norway, or the state of Norway being created, through or by the Norwegian people to forward their interests, eventually gained sovereignty over a large territory. Within this territory, there were the Sami. The Sami people are a nation to a certain extent, or there are many different nations, because they have a shared culture, shared identity, shared traditions, not so much shared language. There are very large language barriers between the different Sami groups, but they would be a nation, but not a nation state, because they do not have sovereignty over a certain territory. They are minorities in Norway, Finland, Sweden, Russia. And the reason I wouldn't say that Norway is a non-nation state because we have a certain sizable Sami minority, that is because historically the Sami people really have not had much power or influence in the Norwegian state. They've been there, but they've been kind of on the frontier. The Norwegians have tried to assimilate them, and that did not work out very well for either, definitely not for the Sami at least. But it also failed because they are quite different today, even though they do speak Norwegian, many of them. But you couldn't really say that Norway is a non-nation state or let's say like an empire, which would be the other example, where you have one nation within a state eventually dominating the rest. Spain would be a good example of this, or Russia, or France, who also, we might view them as a unitary nation state today, but in reality they are a sort of an empire where you have different ethnic and cultural groups around the country, and they've had a very strong political policy of assimilation into the main national French identity. Being a teacher, you can kind of get onto different subtracks while discussing, but I'll try to bring it back a bit. When it comes to again Norway, I would say we are probably one of the most clearest defined nation states in Europe, with very old and very rigid borders. The area where Norwegians live today, if you look at it, it is more or less the same area as was controlled by the very first Norwegian kingdom 1,200 years ago. 1,200 years ago. It formed in 874, 78, around there, by Harald Fairhair, Harald Hårfagre. With Certain variations, we've lost a few areas in Jämtland, and we've gained a few in northern Norway, but we still the area controlled by Norwegians is more or less the same as it was 1,000 years ago. And there's been a lot of discussion about, well, the whole idea of nations or national identity, that is just something which has been created by nationalist politicians in the 1800s. But I would argue that's not the case. You can look back in the sagas, they talked about Norway as a kingdom back then already. And again, the language barriers were still existent there, or at that time. And there is a story from the Battle of Svolder, where a Norwegian king met with Danish forces, and I believe also Swedish forces off the coast of Denmark. And he's like, in the story, he says something about that. Well, the Danes, we can fight them. The Swedes, we can fight them. But who's that other group? Oh, that's the a Norwegian group which is fighting with them. Oh my, they're Norwegians like ourselves. We're going to have a tough fight here. And this idea of the nation, or as that people living in different regions belong to the same whole, I believe is a very old idea and very natural idea. An idea which probably comes back from when we were tribes moving around, that we had certain things in common, belonged to the same group. And language, physical look, these things have had importance in kind of binding us together. So that's what a state, we talked about a state, what a nation is, and a nation state. And then you can also kind of talk about, well, what about non-nation states or multicultural states? Pros and cons. That could also be kind of a video of its own. But in a Europe being a region of many different, being the region where you probably have the best defined nation states and also some empires. That it makes sense to talk about nations here. Other parts of the world, say Africa, where you had many different nations, right? Ethnic, cultural identity groups, etc., who, because of European map drawing, were forced into non-nation states. Regions where you would have many different ethnic groups in the same state competing for power. And that's kind of the difference between Norway and let's say Syria, right? Because in Norway, all the main political parties, they are based around, economic class interests historically, whilst in Syria, they are more ethnic based. Because in Norway, yes, we had the Sami, but they never really had much power or influence. Today they have their own Sami parliament, but that is merely a rådgivende parliament, advice-giving parliament, not a parliament which is sovereign. Whilst, let's say, in Syria, the different party systems there are more ethnic-based. So different ethnic groups competing for power. And, if you look historically at this, countries where political systems are based around ethnic groups rather than class, so, social groups and differences can be erased more easily, whilst ethnic differences are much more difficult to coincide. So there's a difference in conflict, or area of intensity of conflict. And also you see that in nation states there is a higher degree of trust within the same group, as opposed to non-nation states or multi-ethnic states where there are more differences, lower trust, more conflict. But that is more or less a topic of its own. But I hope this made a bit of sense, just to get more of a definition of what a state is. An area which is controlled by a government and is sovereign, a nation, a group of people who view themselves as belonging to the same whole. A little detour once more. You can talk, let's say, Great Britain. In reality, Great Britain is, you could probably say, an empire consisting of, the English nation, the Welsh nation, the Scottish nation, and kind of the Irish nation. And back in the 50s, you had a lot of politicians in England talking about the British nation as a more or less a unit, a nation-esque unit, even though there are cultural differences and language differences between the different national groups, but that they were at least trying to identify themselves as belonging to the same nation. But you have kind of slowly moved away from this, and people talk more about the English nation and the Irish nation, the Scottish nation, etc. Also with independence movements and so forth. But you have other very typical nation states. Norway, very typical nation state. Sweden, typical nation state. Germany, also a nation state, even though it is federal. The main difference there being religious between Catholics and Protestants in North and South. Austria, nation state. Italy, I'm not an expert there, but I would say nation state, but with larger cultural differences than the other countries we've mentioned. France, more of an empire. Spain, definitely more of an empire. Russia, obviously an empire. Finland, nation state, but with a fairly large Swedish minority, which has had influence and power. Just think of Mannerheim, Swede, not a Finn. Might step on some toes there, but hey, what the hell. Furthermore, yes, etc. Typical nation states. And then again, on the other side, you can have states which are non-nation states. States which are non-nation states, multicultural states or empires, where you have larger different ethnic groups. Well, you could say the difference between an empire and a multicultural state would be that in an empire, the empire is dominated by one of the nations, whilst in the multicultural state, that is more equal and there's more competition between the different nations, and also historically more conflict. Well, I hope you found that somewhat interesting. Give me some feedback in the comments section below, and if there are other topics